All right, thank you. Thanks, folks. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our second panel of the morning. We are excited to spend the next hour talking with you all about some long-term threats that we face as conservatives. And as I'll kind of articulate, and my panelists will articulate for you, these threats that are facing us in the movement are not just threats. Folks, if you could take conversations outside, please. Thank you. The threats that are facing us are indeed threats, but they're also great moments of opportunity for us as conservatives. One of the challenges that we have, that we take most seriously at the Heritage Foundation and Heritage Action, is trying to put together a compelling reform agenda, and a compelling reform agenda that can meet the moment of the times that we're in. I think one of the things that Donald Trump got right, that all of the candidates that he was going against didn't get right, is he really properly diagnosed the mood of the country and properly diagnosed issues that were kind of deep underlying issues that the conservative movement may have missed. And what he did, when he did that, he actually brought together a coalition of people who were a different kind of coalition than we've seen in the past. So you look at some of the states that he won, like Pennsylvania, Ohio, Wisconsin, a lot of those kind of Rust Belt areas. He brought new voters into our coalition. But to keep that coalition together, you really have to have a reform agenda that speaks to those voters. And so that's what a lot of us at Heritage and Heritage Action are working on, is trying to speak to those particular issues. And getting those issues right over the course of the next 2 and 3 years is going to be key to actually holding power in Washington and key to implementing our agenda. So I want to walk through with our panelists here. I'm going to ask each of our panelists to take just a couple minutes to briefly introduce you to their issue area and to give you an overview of some of the threats and opportunities that we have coming forward. And then I'll moderate a discussion with all of them. So let me just go down the line and introduce here. Romina Baccia is the Deputy Director at our Rowe Institute, and she covers all things fiscal and will give you a kind of good look here of the fiscal outlook for the United States. Lindsay Burke is the director of our Center for Education Policy. Lindsay's been very innovative in thinking about how to reform K-12 education and higher education. Kalon Kitchen is our senior research fellow in technology, national security, and science. Kalon just came to us from Senator Ben Sass's office, where he was an all-star on that team, and now is going to lead a new issue area for Heritage, where he's going to be pretty interdisciplinary and have to work with all of the different analysts at the Heritage Foundation, because there are so many big issues in the technology world that really are going to require conservatives to think about how to remain moored to their first principles as we approach these new challenges. So my colleagues here will take a few minutes, and let's start here with Romina and kind of walk us through your issue area and what do you see coming down the line.
Thank you, Tim. One of the things we find when it comes to fiscal issues is, if you poll the American people right now, concern for the national debt, deficit, and even federal spending, broadly speaking, by both conservatives and progressives, is very low. But what is high on people's agenda is concern for the economy and for jobs. That is what people care about. And it's because there are values that we all share and things we all care about, and those include economic security, not having to worry about where your next meal will come from or whether you're going to be able to make your mortgage or rent the next month. Financial independence, being able to take care of yourself, your families, and your communities. And legacy, wanting to leave behind an America that is even stronger and more prosperous than the one we're already enjoying. But there are threats on the horizon, and those include excessive federal spending that is on a steep growth trajectory, as well as our deficit, which is rising. What you're seeing here is the latest deficit projections, which were just released from the Congressional Budget Office on April 9th. And what you'll see is that by 2020, we will be at deficit levels in the trillions of dollars, not to return below that level again for the entire decade. And what's And those are deficit levels we have not seen since the Great Recession, which is highly unusual and very troubling for an economy that is currently growing as strongly and robustly as the United States economy is. The deficit projections have gotten worse this year. So the boxes are deficit projections from last year. The blue bars are our latest deficit projections. But there is also opportunity on the horizon. If you look, the deficit projections in the later part of the decade, where that box is a little taller than that blue bar, they've actually gotten better. And that is because that's when we'll see many of the growth effects from the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. So economic growth does help, but it cannot offset Washington's spending appetite. One challenge we face is that the numbers we deal with in Washington are so huge that it's just incredibly difficult for most Americans to wrap their heads around what all this means for them. So one of the ways we're trying to reach more people is by putting those numbers in terms that the average American family can better understand. So a family with about $55,000 in annual income is a median income family. They would be spending about almost $10,000 more than what they earn in any given year and already be over $300,000 in debt, except this is a debt without a house. It's not like a mortgage, it's more like credit card debt. And what we also know, as federal debt reaches levels that approach the size of our economy, from economic research across the political spectrum, including such sources as the International Monetary Fund, which actually tried to debunk what they thought was a myth that debt drags down growth, they too had to acknowledge that we do see lower economic growth when debt reaches levels where it approaches the size of a country's economy. We are looking here at the US debt borrowed in credit markets, and by the end of this decade, in 2028, we will be almost at 100% of GDP. Now, this is the best case scenario because the CBO does not project another economic crisis. So if we did suffer another economic crisis, those growth projections could be reached much sooner. And you might wonder, who's holding all this debt? Who's buying all of this debt that the United States needs in order to finance its government spending? About half of our publicly held debt is owned by Americans, so it's owned domestically. The other half is owned in foreign markets, and by far our largest debt holder is China, followed by Japan, and as you can see, a number of other nations. And I just want to conclude with what's driving this growth in the deficit and debt to give us a basis to talk about. Primarily, it's healthcare. Healthcare cost growth. Almost 40% of the growth in spending just over the next 10 years is driven by healthcare. Social Security, which is a combination of more individuals on the disability programs dropping out of the labor force, and then also the aging of society and the fact that those benefits grow with the size in the economy because they're indexed to wage growth. But interest is a particularly troubling category. It depends on projections for interest rates, so there is some uncertainty there, but interest is spending that we pay to pay for the sins of the past. They don't buy us any benefits today. The other programs, discretionary, which is defense and non-defense domestic programs, about 10% of the growth, and all other mandatory. So you see spending is growing across the board, but healthcare and Social Security and interest are the primary drivers. And I look forward to further discussion on the panel.
Great. Thank you, Romina. Lindsay.
Great, so thanks everyone for being here. This is sort of a depressing panel, right? Threats to conservatism, threats to conservative public policy. And I think Romina made a pretty compelling argument that the debt and the deficit are an existential threat to our way of life. But I have to say, I think that a government-run, government-provided monopoly public education system is going to give you a pretty good run for your money. Because it is a system in which students and teachers alike are having to deal with all kinds of things that I think really are a threat long term. I mean, if we look at the climate in American K-12 public education today, we see so many problems. There are dangerous school discipline policies in place where teachers report, students report, that they feel less safe now than they did a few years ago. We have Planned Parenthood-operated sex education classes in schools across the country. Howard Zinn's People's History of the United States is still a popular textbook in social studies classes across the country. And there is, of course, the ever-present Common Core that is still very much a way of life in public schools. And so this is, I think, a huge indication of how the left has captured the monolithic K-12 public education system today. And that has a real impact on how young people view the world. I'll give you two, I think, pretty jarring points about how young people view the world. 1/3 of millennials today think that George W. Bush killed more people than Stalin. 1/3. Half of millennials think that socialism is a better economic system than capitalism. So when we say that the left has captured the K-12 public education system, this is what we're seeing actually play out in the worldview of young people across the country. And I think that capture on the part of the left is a big part of the reason why we saw such ferocious opposition to Education Secretary Betsy DeVos when she went through her confirmation hearing. And it was, and I truly believe that it was because people understood, the left understood, that what she was bringing to the table, her worldview, that says, you know what, parents know better than some distant bureaucrat who doesn't even know the name of your child, that parents know better, that choice is a better system in education than a monopoly, that the left realized that what she was advocating for really and truly was a threat to this monopoly public education system. And that's why you saw so much pushback during her confirmation hearing. But it's not just what we see in schools across the country. We see that special interest groups in Washington continue to be blockers of reforms to K-12 education. And of course, it goes without saying, the academy is totally lost, right? Higher education, we see problems that are magnified relative to the K-12 system. But we see it in the states as well. Yesterday, 1 million high school students weren't able to go to school because teachers in Arizona and Colorado went on strike under the auspices of the Red for Ed movement. So 1 million kids missed class yesterday as a result of these strikes. So we see the consequences play out at the state level, at the local level, through federal policy, and in classrooms across the country. But I am optimistic, I am eternally optimistic, and I'll just leave you with one little data point on this. If you go back to relatively recent history, the year 2000, there were just 4 states that had any type of school choice program at all. So a voucher, tax credit scholarship, the newer education savings account models that are in place, just 4 states. Today, there are 63 private school choice programs operating in 30 states and DC. So more than half of states have some form of education choice option in place for families. And so if I'm the union side, if I'm the special interest right now, I am shaking in my boots looking at that momentum on school choice across the country. So I am very optimistic moving forward about what we'll see, despite the threats that do exist to conservatism.
Thank you, Lindsay. Klon.
Good morning. Thank you for having me. As Tim mentioned, my area of focus is technology, national security, science policy. And one of the reasons why Heritage has decided to really double down on these issues is because it's become very clear here recently that emerging technologies are going to have very fundamental impacts across the human experience in economics, social life, political life, certainly in a national security context. And many of these technologies offer great promise, opportunities for tailored medicine that will greatly extend life and improve human thriving, and all kinds of wonderful opportunities. However, many of these technologies offer very difficult challenges as well. They provoke deep ethical questions. They strike very dangerous opportunities for people who would challenge or oppose the United States and what it intends to do. And for too long, many of these conversations have been dominated by a liberal voice in many of the ways in terms of some of the social development of technologies, whether it be social media networks or similar capabilities. There hasn't been a meaningful conservative voice in that conversation, and that has allowed a type of technological idealism to kind of run amok, and for innovation to be occurring for innovation's sake instead of bound within the context of innovation for human thriving. Well, as the stakes for these conversations continue to go up, Heritage has decided that we can't abandon the field on these conversations. In fact, we need to be leading and shaping these conversations. And so I've been given the amazing opportunity to come in and to help think through these issues. And I have essentially two clear mandates. The first is to, as Tim mentioned, develop an interdisciplinary effort across the entire foundation of thinking comprehensively and coherently about tech policy in these various spheres. The second mandate that I have personally is my research and my effort is really going to be focused on the intersection of national security and technology. So I'm thinking about things like artificial intelligence and the race with China to realize the benefits of that and to mitigate the challenges. So these are the very real things that we need to engage. These are very real challenges. At the same time, I am fundamentally optimistic, and the reason I say that is because we have a coherent worldview that actually offers the types of principles and fundamental presuppositions necessary to realize the benefits of technology while also mitigating the challenges and the threats. And we, I think as Ms. James said last night, a debate is good for us because we win those. So I believe that conservatives have an intellectual foundation that is just simply superior. It just provides better answers for understanding what's going on now and how we might move forward in a way that profits us individually and also as a society.
Fantastic. Thank you, Klon. Okay, well, let's start there, actually, on the technological front. I think that there are a lot of overlaps in all three of your issue areas here. Robert Reich has been pushing this idea of a universal basic income, and many others have started to push the idea, even on the right. Murray's pushed it on the right, a few others. And what we see with this is that people are making the argument that technology is going to become so advanced that it's basically going to create a lot of enrichment for the country, but you've got to find a way to circulate that money back to people, and people are going to be out of jobs because of automation and whatnot. If you guys could each, weigh in on this, I think each of you have issue areas. Romina, I'd be interested in you weighing in, especially on the fiscal side on this particular issue. Klon, I think you have a lot to speak to in terms of educating the workforce and building up human capital for the next generation in this kind of in this huge transition. I mean, you've talked about it as a second industrial revolution. And Lindsay, I think this is a good opportunity to talk about what we're trying to do with higher education and the HERO Act and things like that. So maybe we'll just start with Klon and walk and go down.
Sure, I'll set the stage and then you guys. So the potential and the challenge of automation is real. Automation is automation is simply the idea that machines and computers will increasingly be able to do what has historically been human work more efficiently and better than humans can. And that's everything from automating manufacturing to automated vehicles, driving our taxis and the like. So automation is real. That is going to happen. It is, in fact, the case that we have experienced all kinds of technological disruption in the past, and we've kind of moved through that, and that government intervention and kind of work programs, they've never really produced the promised results. I think that is going to continue to be a reality in this context. I will say that one of the things that makes this discussion perhaps a little more difficult is the scale of the disruption that's going to occur simultaneously. So it won't just be that we're transitioning from the horse and buggy to the Model T, but that at the same time, we're also transitioning in terms of entire workforces now competing against machines. One of the perhaps less known, but I think you'll get it very quickly, is in law firms. So you're going to continue to have associates and partners, but you're going to have fewer. And the reason is because we're now getting to the place to where through machine learning and other capabilities, you can task your digital assistant to review cases and to identify both, kind of the types of connections that a human would be able to discern, but then also a bunch of connections that a human might not be able to do. And you're going to be able to do so at scale that just far surpasses anything that a human can do. And it's going to be increasingly smart so that it can actually return results to a partner who tasks that assistant. And it'll be contextually aware. So it just won't say, okay, there's been this number of cases associated with this issue, but it will go down to, and they've been decided this way in this district at this point in time, and has had this kind of follow-on implications over the last 5 years of jurisprudence. And then provide that to the lawyer who's writing the brief at that given time in the specific context of why they asked the question to begin with. Right? So that's just an industry, a specific type of disruption, and what we're going to see is a much broader scale. It's essentially going to touch everything. It's going to touch medicine. It's certainly going to touch national defense and the like. And the short answer is no, we're not ready. We have a human capital pipeline into the workforce that's not ready. I think we see that by so much of this innovation being driven by foreign markets and foreign students. And it's something we're going to have to tackle very seriously, and it's necessary that we do so.
So now when we have interns who come and ask, should I go to law school, I can give them another reason to tell them no. Thanks for that. Look, I mean, technology in the education space, I agree there are challenges, but there are also huge opportunities. Tim mentioned HERO. That's one of the big ones. If you think about higher education today, it's expensive. It's expensive, and a lot of people would argue not valuable, that employers don't value what students are bringing to the table after they graduate. And we could all list the baristas at Starbucks with master's degrees. So there are inherent problems to our current model of higher education. But the way I think about it is right now, higher education, college is more expensive than it has been ever at a time when access to knowledge is cheaper and more accessible than at any other point in human history. Right? So there's a big disconnect. And I think that is a threat to the higher education model in a good way. And so what we're trying to do is catalyze that threat through something known as HERO. This is the Higher Education Reform and Opportunity Act. And this would basically break up what is a federal accreditation cartel that's been in place for about 50 years now, where basically the federal government says to universities that your students can't access student loans and grants unless they go through an accredited college that has been accredited through this sort of de facto federal system of accreditation. And the net result of that is that you have entire universities that receive accreditation, but it tells you nothing about the value of the actual courses and the content that's being taught in those universities. And at the same time, it's a huge barrier to entry. So if you want to have an innovative higher education startup, it is incredibly difficult to become accredited. In fact, you have to operate for 2 years before you can even go through accreditation, but students won't attend because you're unaccredited. So there's this weird situation in which it becomes just a huge barrier because of the way that accreditation is currently set up. So what we've been working to do is break that apart, to break the link between accreditation and access to student loans and grants, and devolve that down to the state level, ultimately get us to a point where accreditation is voluntary. And it used to be that way. It used to be that accreditation was much more of a peer review process between institutions. So Harvard would say Yale is a quality institution, it's good for everybody, that we have quality institutions in the market. But eventually, as they always do, the federal government just couldn't help itself and decided to get involved and to tell universities that they had to go through this very specific means of accreditation. So we want to break all of that up and basically create a system where a student can access their loans and grants and go to individual courses if they want. They could do a semester at a university, do a semester in an apprenticeship program, take some individual online courses, basically create an a la carte higher education experience. Oh, and by the way, bypass all of these useless feminist underwater basket weaving courses that you have to take to get a bachelor's degree. So it will be much more efficient, much more useful, we think, on the employer side, but a lot of that will come down to the technological aspect. And can I just say one other thing really quickly, just in the K-12 space, technology is really important as well in the sense that it is enabling students to access online courses, private tutors, and the way that we pay for that is through an education savings account model where families can now access, in some states, the money that would have been spent on their child in the public school. That money literally goes onto a debit card that the parent controls, and then they can pay for any education-related service, product, or provider. So private school tuition, online learning, private tutors, special education services and therapies if they need it, whatever is the right fit for their child. And a lot of that, too, is technologically related.
Fantastic.
And I'll bring it all home, I hope. America is still the land of opportunity. Everybody can become a taxpayer.
Yeah.
And we're going to need a lot of those taxpayers if we want to provide a universal basic income. Already, 7 out of every $10 that the federal government spends are spent on a transfer program. So we basically already have a similar system to that. Now, there have been some countries that have tried universal basic income. It was voted down in Switzerland. They held a popular referendum. It didn't make it. Norway is now abandoning their experiment. And I know there is a county, I think, in California that's trying it out now. And I don't think we're going to see it go very far. If it would be very destructive. Because what we do know is that, yes, we have labor market distortions. But the problem is not that we have millions of Americans trying to find work that they cannot find. In fact, our businesses have the opposite problem. They have thousands and thousands of jobs available and nobody to show up and take them and do them. We did a workforce roundtable in Ohio recently, and their manufacturing force is actually relying heavily on technology, but they still need labor. And they have so many openings that they cannot fill. And why is that? Well, unemployment is now at 4%, which is a very, very low level in the United States because it includes several people that just haven't been able to get into the disability program or that are perhaps briefly out of the labor force, but it's not a market that's available to just be employed. The other aspect is that we have problems that are keeping people from moving. So they may be living in rural areas where the jobs are not there. But if they were to move to more urban centers or other areas where manufacturing is happening, which also happens in rural areas, they could get those jobs. But what's keeping them from moving, in part, are restrictive housing policies. That is one of the largest impediments for workers to move into areas where they can actually find jobs. And that has a lot to do with zoning rules that have driven up the price of housing and are keeping workers from the jobs where they can make a better living for themselves and their families. And a universal basic income is not going to fix any of that. And just this week, I think it was, Senator Sanders put out a proposal where he wants to give everybody who wants it a government job. So it's with benefits.
Security,
with
right
benefits. There. And the idea is basically would be like a universal basic income, but you're also going to ask people to work for it in the government. Well, needless to say, that is also not a winning proposition. That is a make-work program that will not work and will be incredibly expensive. So I am actually very optimistic on this front that technology is not there will be transition costs. But we've gone through many technological transitions. When ATMs were adopted in the banking system, we heard worries that all these bankers were going to lose their jobs. The banking system now employs more people than before we had ATMs, but they do other things. They're now advising people in financial services and insurance. So this is how countries become wealthy, is through the use of technology, allowing us to do more with less, to employ man hours in a more efficient way. And I think we will see the same thing happening with the current technological transition. So I'm more optimistic there than I'm worried.
Thank you. I think what you're talking about there, Romina, is particularly important, and I'm glad that our friend Paul Teller is in the room, because I think if the administration actually does go forward on an infrastructure package, I think that it's really important to approach this in an outside-the-box way, not at the traditional Washington way where an infrastructure package looks like a massive federal spending bill where you just throw money at the problem. I think it's important to look at this in terms of what we've been talking about here. I mean, the most important thing, if we want to put people to work and we want to get this country going in the right direction, people have to have the skills to do it. Mm-hmm. It's not, it seems possible to me that something like the Higher Education Reform Act should actually be part of an infrastructure package. I mean, that is putting people to work on jobs that are actually building this country. So take that as a little nudge, Paul, when you go back to your work. But it's going to be an important way to kind of approach these problems. Let's do a quick lightning round because I want to get to audience questions, but I also have I'd like to highlight one more area for each of you. Lindsay, if you could take a few minutes and just talk about the work we're doing on military ESAs, I think that would be interesting to folks.
So I think this is one of the most exciting things in our education center that we're working on right now. I wake up and think about it and go to bed thinking about it. I don't really have a life, I know, but it's going to be worth it. So we have developed a proposal, and we're starting to see it gain some pretty considerable momentum on the Hill to enable military families to exercise school choice. This is such a no-brainer, right? I mean, and the reason we started thinking about this was we read a poll about a year ago where military families had been surveyed, and they said about a third of these military families, active duty service members, said that they had thought about leaving the military altogether because of the schools their kids would have to attend at the next duty station that they got assigned to. A third. So we saw that. My breath was taken away because we immediately thought, this is not just an education policy issue, this is a national security issue. And so we started thinking about how we can alleviate that problem, and it became very evident very quickly that the best way to do that is take existing federal funds that go directly to government schools, right? So when a military family gets assigned to their next duty station, and they've said, we're gonna sacrifice, and the member has signed up for that sacrifice, their child's also sacrificing. Their child is getting assigned to whatever government-run school is closest to that duty station. And of course, regardless of whether or not it's a good fit. And then federal dollars follow those children to that public school system. So we said, let's do what we always do on school choice. Let's separate the financing of education from the delivery of services. Let's take those existing federal funds and let's fund the child instead, and provide them, I described an education savings account earlier, provide them with an education savings account and enable military families to craft an education that is the right fit for their child. So we think that this has tremendous military recruitment implications, retention implications, and like I said, is both an education policy and national security issue. Indeed, and
we're really excited about it on so many levels, and we do have an opportunity in the House this year potentially to get a vote on it. We're trying to attach it to the National Defense Authorization Act, and we'll be pushing very hard for a vote on the House floor. And just one other point on this, this is, aside from all the right reasons to do it, it's also incredibly strategic because we think that if you're able to enact something like this, but first of all, step back for a second. We can't do school choice from the federal level.
That's right.
We don't believe in that, right? But here's an opportunity that Congress can actually act on this because it's appropriate for Congress to be talking about what's happening with the military. And so we think if you get this in place, think about what happens in a state like Texas or a state like California. Texas and California have more military families in their states than any of the other states. Neither of those states have school choice. Texas right now, there's a big debate in the state legislature about that. Sorry, I'm buzzing here. There's a big debate in Texas about that. And so what happens if that is actually enacted and then people in Texas see the military family that lives down the street from them utilizing school choice and being able to send their kids where they want to? Well, that actually puts upward pressure on the state legislature for a local decision on school choice. So we think it's a strategically important bill to get in place. Romina, let's talk about something that's very timely. Right now, the White House is trying to draft a rescissions package to send to Capitol Hill. They're talking about a rescissions package of around $25 billion is the last number that I've heard. Talk about what that rescissions package actually is, why it's important, and what you think the prospects are.
So a rescissions package allows the President and Congress to work together to pull back funds that were already appropriated. It's actually used to be quite common to do rescissions because sometimes it does happen that the federal government appropriates too much spending. Believe it or not, it does happen. And later they realize they have a better use for those funds. But in this case, this past year, there was a giant party, a giant spending party in Washington, and none of us were invited. But we will all be invited to pay the bill when it comes due. And so the rescissions are a way for Congress and the President to fast track a spending cut package in Congress. It wouldn't need a 60-vote majority in the Senate. It could be done with a simple majority vote, the same way that Republicans achieved tax reform. They could use that, a similar mechanism with rescissions to reduce spending. And there are two immediate opportunities. There are still funds that were appropriated as part of the Sandy package, $50 billion, much of which was pork barrel spending, that could be pulled back. There's still unspent funds from that package. We saw several disaster aid packages this year, and some of that funding was necessary to rebuild those areas affected by the hurricanes, but there was also a lot of wasteful spending in those packages, so that's an opportunity to roll that back. And then the Bipartisan Budget Act, the omnibus that you heard about in the previous panel. If the administration and Congress try to enact the president's proposal, so roll back all of the spending increase that was agreed to and implement the president's cuts, there's about $100 billion that they could cut. So $25 billion, rather moderate, I would say. But we're very excited about that. It's a very important effort. And if they can succeed, I think it can build momentum to do a lot more than that. Because $25 billion is just the beginning. We have a $4 trillion budget, and it's growing just from this year to next year by over $300 billion. So we will barely reduce the growth in spending. So it's necessary, and I hope that it will build momentum to go much, much bigger in the next round.
Hear, hear. Yeah, we at Heritage Action will be very active on this. When this bill comes from the White House, we will be pushing the House to pass it as quickly as possible. And the idea would be, after it passes the House, to put a lot of pressure on the Senate. The Senate has said they don't want to do it. The Senate has said they don't have the votes. But I think they need to feel the pressure to do it. And we'll be targeting, hopefully, when we get details on this, the spending cuts will be targeted enough that there's just really no excuse for the Senate not to produce 51 votes on it. And I agree, Romina, once you pass this, that's momentum building. You can do another rescissions package, you know, and we have to, it'll be our job at Heritage and Heritage Action, if it's passed, to make sure that it's a politically rewarding experience, so that you can then build on that, momentum. Kalon, last question, and then we'll go to the audience. You've talked a lot about this kind of artificial intelligence arms race that we have with China as a massive looming threat. Can you just kind of give people an overview of what you're working on there?
Yeah, so I've alluded to this a bit. The interesting thing about artificial intelligence is that it becomes a key enabling technology for so many other things. So it's not just that you get a faster missile, but you begin getting faster missiles with the capability to jam area denial or counter missile systems, and then AI then enables better strategies for the utilization of those technologies, and then it couples with other AI-enabled capabilities to where it really spins out of control pretty quickly. China has decided to make a whole of society bet on this technology, and what I mean by that is it's an authoritarian state, it's totalitarian in nature, And the government in Beijing is under the impression that it can arrange its society, economic, socially, and politically, to realize the benefits of artificial intelligence before the United States. And in so doing, actually set the conditions for how AI will be understood and realized across the globe to kind of set the international standards on those issues. Because it is an authoritarian state, it will enjoy certain, what I'll call near-term advantages in the development of AI. So AI is fueled by data. And the Chinese government is not constrained in its ability to collect data on its citizens. You may know about its citizenship scores. So right now, they have near ubiquitous surveillance on their people, and they're commingling that information with how individual Chinese vote, how they shop online, what their job is, and they're now beginning to assign citizenship scores. And individual Chinese, based upon their citizenship score, that determines what type of job they can have, what type of additional work training, what type of political affiliations they can maintain, and all kinds of things like that. Well, so because of the ubiquitous surveillance, as an example, there have been 3 competitions in the last 3 years for artificial intelligence-enabled facial recognition systems, and it's been a Chinese company that's won all 3 years. And it's because they have tons and tons of data. Okay, so that's a reality. But there's another race going on in parallel with that, and that is things that I think you would all agree with. That type of a surveillance state, that type of authoritarianism, that type of totalitarianism is corrosive to a society. And so they are, I think, trying to build a house as quickly as they can on a foundation of sand. And so the race is, how quickly can they realize the benefits and opportunities of AI without fundamentally and decisively corroding their society? And I don't think that is at all guaranteed for them to win. And in fact, I think the long-term advantage is to the United States. I do think, though, that in an effort to kind of mitigate that kind of near-term challenge, we do need a deliberate, comprehensive effort. We need to be thinking about this, and I'll end with this quick statement. I would like to encourage you in the knowledge that it is my understanding and assessment that we do not lack technical capability. We have brilliant men and women pursuing all of these things, both inside the private sector and inside the government. We do not lack the technical or industrial means to realize these benefits. We're doing very good. What we need to spend more time on is the political will and the deliberate development of strategy, kind of grand strategy for technology realization. And then the final thing that I think kind of bundles this up that I wanted to piggyback off of something Lindsay said, technology is enabling, and the disruptions that technology are bringing are going to require lifetime learners. I have 4 children. We're trying to teach them it's unlikely that they're going to be in a job for 30 years. And what they're likely to do is change careers maybe 4 or 5 times, and that to do that and to thrive, they're going to have to be continual learners. By God's grace, technology is going to enable that in a way that we haven't been able to realize before. One of the additional benefits of that is that if you're a lifelong learner, you have critical thinking skills, and you have an intellectual curiosity, and you have a capacity to actually inform yourself. Okay, that plays to our benefit for many of the reasons that we've been describing in terms of we have a coherent worldview that is logical and provides better explanations for the world than does the liberal or kind of socialist alternatives. So I think over the long term, I'm actually quite encouraged, but it's going to take some deliberate work to realize that.
Indeed, thank you. Let's go to questions from the audience. Yes, sir, right here in the blue.
Hi, my name is John Reese from Charleston, South Carolina. I have a 2-part question on education and education debt. When I went to MUSC, Medical University of South Carolina, in 1984, tuition was $1,179 a semester. Now it's $25,000 a semester. Cost is 20 times more, but I don't see that the education is 20 times better. As a matter of fact, I told the dean that, just to get out of dental school alone, student loan debt is over $250,000 for dental school alone. Yeah. I told the dean he is creating an entire generation of prostitutes that will do whatever it takes to make money to pay that debt. Again, it's a problem. The second part of that question is that universities continue to raise tuition, and they continue to claim that they don't have enough money to pay the teachers and all that sort of thing. Yet, in the face of all that, they continue to buy up land all over their towns and pretty much create college towns with nothing but a college in there.
That's right.
So the question is, what can be done about the increasing tuition and the student loan debts, which I think are inextricably commingled, because obviously if they can get more debt approved, then they can increase the tuitions and keep these people enslaved. And the second thing is, how do we combat the power grab, or the land grab by these universities?
Great question. So you have perfectly articulated what is commonly referred to as the Bennett hypothesis, this idea that increased federal subsidies over the past 4 decades roughly has led to dramatic increases in college costs. I mean, and the example that you gave, what did you say, 20 times higher than it was? I mean, we see that over and over again. And it's because, I would argue, we are dumping money out of helicopters onto universities from the federal level. And that does enable them to raise tuition profligately with no repercussions, but huge repercussions for the student and for debt, but for the university, they don't experience it. And so what we see is this vicious lending and spending cycle whereby universities raise tuition because they are fully aware that students can run to the federal government, get a loan that is subsidized by taxpayers with virtually no credit check or questions about what you plan to study, any sort of consideration for the type of student that you are, and they get those loans, and universities raise tuition, and it's just this cycle that continues over and over again. So we hit a really unfortunate milestone last week. I don't know if anybody saw this, but we hit for the first time $1.5 trillion in outstanding student loan debt across the country. That's more than credit card debt. I mean, it's a breathtaking amount of money. And I would argue it is because of the ubiquity of federal subsidies. So to answer your question, the way that we fix that is we cut off the open spigot of federal student aid, full stop. We now have, yeah, one person likes it. We now have, we now have a system where 93% actually, of all student loans are originated and serviced at the federal level. So the federal government is providing 93% of student loans. So what does that mean as a taxpayer? It means that when a student defaults, or when we have increasingly generous loan forgiveness policies that the federal government implements, you, the taxpayer, pay for it. You, the taxpayer, includes the majority, vast majority, 3/4 nearly of Americans who don't themselves hold bachelor's degrees. The truck drivers and the electricians and the folks who will presumably not earn as much as their college-going counterparts. So to finance higher ed costs through a way overgenerous federal lending system is the most inequitable way you could possibly think about financing higher education. So we would argue cut off that open spigot, allow space for a private lending market to reemerge. That private lending market will actually provide much, I would argue, fairer way to finance because they can take into account all kinds of factors about the student, forward-looking and backward-looking factors. On the land grab question, it's probably a little out of my depth, but I will say what I do know is that Clemson, was it Clemson? No, LSU. Who are the Tigers? Clemson?
Yeah, and they're both Tigers. Both.
They're both.
Yeah.
One of them.
One of the Tigers.
One of the Tigers built a tiger grotto, right? I mean, it's ridiculous. There are gorgeous climbing walls at universities across the country. It really is. It's a facilities arms race. And again, it's enabled by the ubiquity of federal lending.
Yeah. Right here. And
you know, it would seem that a way you could really cut off those loans when a student goes for a loan, all of these colleges have a 501c3, and they have more money than they really need in reserves. They keep building the reserves. So maybe if the colleges were responsible for the student not paying their debt back, that would resolve this problem, and it would resolve it quickly. And the colleges then would be responsible to make sure that the kids got a good job, or they were able to pay that loan back. And it would put them in the same, instead of just always going for more money and saying we need more reserves when they don't really need all that reserve money.
So this is an idea that's gaining popularity as well. It's something people frequently refer to it as colleges having skin in the game about what their students are learning and their ability to repay their loans down the road. I think there's a lot of merit to that idea. So there's a possibility that maybe you create some unintended consequences, maybe where a college will look at a student on the front end and say, it doesn't look like they would be a good student for who knows what reason, and then don't admit them because they're worried about having to repay their loans. So there is that possibility, but I think on balance, it's probably a move in the right direction. I like thinking about it, though, at the institution level itself. So Purdue's a good example of this. Purdue, as a university, is actually originating loans from the university to students. And they have done their own sort of skin in the game situation where a student basically signs a contract with Purdue saying, I will come to Purdue, get a quality education, major in engineering, whatever it is. Maybe I'll do that at no cost to me on the front end, but then once I get a job, then the university will get a piece of my earnings down the road. So universities are coming up with creative ways to think about alternatives to financing. We'll see if that catches on, but the skin in the game issue is definitely gaining popularity.
Mm-hmm. And Purdue hasn't raised their tuition in
That's right.
5 or 6 years.
That's right.
So right here.
You know, an anecdotal, I'm sorry, I forgot who's holding the microphone. My hand's on the table. Anecdotally, I speak to education. I volunteer at a high school tutoring students in the Naples area, one of their large high schools. Kids who go there are not, socioeconomically lower middle class, I'd say. Yeah. And after school, they come into these huge rooms with all kinds of computers, 20, 30 at a time, substitute teachers, myself as a volunteer. I'm there trying to work on math with a student. And I noticed 5 or 6 kids, or with a couple of substitute teachers, they're addressing the Florida school shooting, teaching the kids how we're going to circumvent school board rules. We can get you out of class during school time, even though it's against school board rules. And the other day, I'm a retired cardiac surgeon. The kid tells me he's learning healthcare. He's about 13, 14 years old. I ask him what he's doing on the computer. What is he doing? Trying to write a paragraph on euthanasia. Now, to me, it's obvious there's political threads going through their whole educational system. And when I called the principal's office, wanted to volunteer more, 5, 6 times, never a response. Yeah. So that's what's going on.
Yeah, I mean, so we can't just shove computers in the classroom or shove kids in a room full of computers and think that's the type of technology that will improve learning outcomes. What is valuable, and Klon can talk about this way better than I can, but I think at this point at least, what is most valuable in the education space is the competition with non-consumption. So for the students who have no access to a Spanish teacher or an AP physics course or whatever it might be, the ability through technology to actually have them access a private tutor or a teacher who can teach that, I think is where the real possibility lies. And of course, if you read anything on disruptive innovation, Clayton Christensen's work at Harvard Business School, it's really interesting because eventually that non-consumption starts to compete with the sort of mainstream models of delivery. And so it's a slow process, but I think we have to think about it apart from just, can't just shove computers in a classroom and think everything's going to work out well, but the ability for technology to actually provide some options to kids who would otherwise have no access. I don't know if I described that.
That's totally great.
The way, okay.
Totally agree.
Sorry, we have right here in the front.
Yeah, I want to know what the status of the work requirement from the 1996.
Yeah.
The 96 Welfare Reform Act. I know Obama dropped the requirement. Is the current administration bringing it back? Because that's the best way to move people from welfare to work. Giuliani used it to save New York City, and other cities have used it. The ones who use it were able to save their cities. I think that's the only way that we can move people into the workforce and possibly pay down some of this debt, get people off of welfare.
Yeah, good question. And Romina, I'm going to get you in here a little bit on entitlement reform in general. It's a timely question because right now we are currently talking with folks in the House who are talking about putting together a farm bill. And the bill will contain, we think, a decent work requirement in it, and we're working hard to ensure that it does contain that. The administration is supportive of that, and you can talk to Paul about it after the panel. He'll be around for a little bit. So we're working with them to advance that. We think that welfare reform, going back to that, what we did in 1996, is tremendously important right now. And the way we're starting to view this is, you know, one of the things we're working on with our friends in the administration is that the president is hesitant to touch any sort of entitlement reforms. We think, though, that if you can get him supportive of, and he is, a work requirement and welfare reform, and then demonstrate that there's some success on this particular issue, we think that will warm the water a little bit and allow the president to come with us on maybe the next step is you know, Social Security disability, or and then go to the bigger ones like that. But Romina, why don't you talk to the broader issue of entitlement reform and how we're trying to move forward on it?
Yeah. Yeah, I think that the Farm Bill certainly is one important opportunity to revive the work requirements that have been watered down since welfare reform in 1996. We're also seeing many states now experimenting with Medicaid waivers that allow them to use work requirements for that population. In terms of broader entitlement reform, we were very encouraged to see in the president's budget, for the first time, for Republicans and Democrats in previous years, there was no effort to do anything about the Social Security disability insurance program. That program has tremendously expanded to where now 1 out of every 20 Americans is on the Social Security disability program. And 1/3 of the decline in labor force participation that we saw since the Great Recession can be attributed to individuals joining the disability program. And at that time, it's quite possible that they had no other option, or they felt like there was no other option. But instead of it being a hand up, it ends up becoming a permanent hand out that keeps them from returning to the labor market. And so one of the exciting things we saw in the president's budget that reflected much of the work also that we have been doing in this space, especially since 2014, is to try out methods to help people return to work. But I think one of the important ones there, that there is legislation in both the House and Senate. It is not moving at this time, but it's the Social Security Disability Insurance Return to Work Act. And what that would do is something that many other countries, also countries with much larger welfare states, have figured out a long time ago, which is that you need to have a temporary disability program that targets those individuals with marginal disabilities and conditions that can improve with treatment and time. Our program is one or nothing. You're either in or out, and once you're in, you never come off. A temporary program allows us to provide that hand up when it's needed, especially during an economic downturn, but then also to help these people and encourage and nudge them, and also give them a glide path to begin earning again and then transition back to the workforce. That is so critical. Just one more example in terms of how easy it's gotten to get into Social Security disability program. If you're 45 and older and you claim not to speak proficient English, by the way, nobody's going to verify that or test that, you have an easier chance of getting in the program. It doesn't matter where you live. You could live in a part of California or in Puerto Rico where Spanish is widely used, and it doesn't matter. Our work schedule that we compare to determine whether there's another job in the national economy that a person could do hasn't been updated since 1996. Think about the jobs that existed before 1996 and what economy we live in today. It's woefully outdated. So there's a necessity to tackle this problem, and it also will help with some of our labor shortages that we're beginning to see. To the extent that workers have dropped out of the labor force entirely, we need to bring them back in. And it will pay benefits to them and their families as they're beginning to work, contributing to their communities in that way, and also will see higher earnings than the benefits that they receive from the federal government.
Great. Unfortunately, we've run out of time. Please join me in thanking our panelists.